Merci beaucoup. Je précise d'abord pourquoi je parle en anglais, c'est parce que tu m'as demandé de parler en anglais. Bien sûr, c'est un grand plaisir. It's a great pleasure, first of all, to be here and to be invited by David and the research group, which I really esteem very much. And actually, as I said, David asked me to give this lecture in English, and I accepted with pleasure always, because it means, and you will see, it means that you have to change your own way of seeing things. Each time you present it in another language, you learn new things about your own way of thinking, because in another language it's not really the same. And this is exactly what differential comparison, and this is the topic of this lecture, is about. And that's why he's right saying, I didn't mind, because it's a challenge, and you will see, even if you can have a discussion in different languages, on several languages, it's extremely interesting to see what happens and what moves when we change language. So. And thank you again for the invitation. It's such a pleasure, I must say. It is always, for me, very challenging. And among the different places where I work with people and doctrines, I think Belgium is really a top place, and with very, very good doctrines and researchers. And I'm always very, very, very happy to be here and discuss really with all of you. So, in this talk, I would like to present some aspects of a special comparative method I have developed over the past 10 years and applied to different discursive, literary and related cultural practices. This method is based on the observation that literary writing proceeds from a complex process of differentiation, which I think worth to be focused on. You have the handout, huh? With the different points and especially the quotations in French. Differentiation is an aspect which I think worth to be focused on. Differentiation is, to my opinion, the fundamental process at work, not only in literary writing, but also in the evolution of languages. Spanish, Italian, and French, to take them as examples, are as many ways to differ from Latin. Creole languages came into existence by differing from the conquerors French, English, and Spanish. These new languages create new ways of saying and seeing the world. So does literary writing. In order to explore this complex process, I developed a method that is also based on differentiation, a comparative method that allows to differentiate literary phenomena instead of universalizing and generalizing them. The tendency to universalize or generalize literary genres, periods, and practices is indeed more common, but it bears the danger of producing stereotypes and commonplace observations that do not justice to the complexity of the literary facts and works under scrutiny. If differential comparison puts focus on the process of differentiation, it does not lead, as I will show, to the discovery of irreducible differences. It enables us, on the contrary, to realize that literary writing is fundamentally dialogical, and that it draws its capacity to create new and newly relevant meaning from the ongoing and constitutive interaction with other discursive and cultural practices, other languages and other media. And this is an important aspect of your project. And other cultures, of course. It focuses on the multiple ways literary writing functions. It does not aim to state what literature is. As we will see, comparison proves more efficient as a heuristic tool when applied to dynamic functions of literary writing and its mediatization, rather than presupposed static and reified features of literature, functions rather than features. Differential comparison is a fundamentally functionalist approach. As such, it shares important presuppositions with the approach the modern group, or shall I say MDRN group, that's it, the MDRN group is currently working on. So I come to the first point, differentiation as opposed to universalization. Differential comparison, as I understand it, can be related to the concept of diversality, diversalité, developed by the writers of the Caribbean. This neologism puts the concept of universality itself into question. Thus, Patrick Chamoiseau claims, quote number 1, une parole de rire amer contre l'unique et le même. Une parole tranquillement diverselle contre l'universel. In the post-colonial context, the insistence on the diversal and on diversality implies political protest. In the context of a theoretical paradigm, which interests us here in search of an efficient method for literary and cultural analysis, the concept of diversality puts into question universalistic presumptions, dogmata, and essentialist categorizations which have ceased to be questioned. We cannot compare which is the same, states the comparatist Earl Minor. The recognition of difference and differentiation is indeed essential to the act of comparing. Nevertheless, many comparative studies put the focus immediately on what is the same, searching for presumed universals and neglecting what is different and differential. Universalistic presuppositions still dominate the research in many fields of linguistic, literary, and cultural analysis. Literary historiography, a field that the MDRN research group aims to renew, is one of them. So is the definition and classification of literary and non-literary genres. The example of the macro-genre tale can illustrate this. Traditional scholarship on the tale is still strongly determined by the index of tale types established by the folklorists Arne and Thompson in the first half of the 20th century. Most literary scholars still refer to this index, which is based on the presumption that all tales, all, oral or written, emerging in whatever period, language or culture in the world, should be considered as variants or versions of the tale types established by Arne and Thompson. This presumption includes the tales that have become our canonical and classical fairy tales, such as Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, and some more. Nearly all of them originally appeared in sophisticated volumes authored by highly cultivated academicians and writers as the Italian Giambattista Basile, the French Charles Perrault, the German scholars Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, and the Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen. That's about the four authors of these canonical fairy tales mixed with some others. In the universalistic approach underlying the index of tale types, the single tales are drawn from the meaningful co-textual neighborhood and framing they were originally placed in, and they are also isolated from their specific discursive and social historical context. They are altogether detextualized and decontextualized. Thus, each of the 8 prose tales published by Charles Perrault in 1697 under the significant title Histoire ou conte du temps passé, avec des moralités, is reduced to the set of themes and motives that constitute the tale type that it is said to be a variant of, in the folklorist perspective. Huh? But Perrault's famous texts are not made of themes and motives alone. None of the very complex, scenographic, generic, textual, intertextual, co-textual, and paratextual procedures of his volume is taken into consideration in the universalistic, folkloristic approach. This applies to all the volumes of the author mentioned before. The heuristic inefficiency of this kind of universalizing analysis is due, I think, to the fact that it reduces the complexity of literary works by comparing them to pre-constructed, presumptively universal models that are too simple and thus inapt to take into consideration the complexity of any discourse, let alone literary discourse. I will return later to the example of the tale as a highly universal genre in need of differentiation, a situation this genre shares with many others. One example is the modernist novel, for instance. The need of differentiation. That's what you try to do, differentiate these generic labels. The paradigm of differentiation is opposed not only to the 19th century's universalistic presumptions, but also to those that emerge nowadays. Franco Moratti, Italo-American comparatist, invites us, I quote, to arm ourselves with new statements on world literature and the universal system of literature. Such a generalization does not take into account the fact that the notion of literature itself does not denote the same social discursive reality in all the languages and cultures of the world. Moratti claims to have discovered, I quote, the world system of the novel by an approach he calls distant reading as opposed to close reading. Instead of reading the novels themselves, an activity which he deems too time-consuming and, I quote, too subjective, he turns to bibliographies of studies, some of which seriously outdated, that cover the so-called novels of all kinds, periods and cultures, without ever putting into question the criteria underlying their generic classification as novels, nor the relevance of the generic labels given to them. Moratti pretends to draw objective data from this second-hand material. He transfers them into graphs and trees, that's the title of his last book, in order to establish what he calls a universal map of the world novel. The pseudo-objective approach and the distant reading, which amounts in fact to non-reading, advocated by Moratti, makes us lose, as the Italian scholar Velpoliti rightly states, nothing less than the object of our studies itself. This is, and here I state the definition of the MPRN group, which I fully agree with, the object of our studies, texts understood in the widest possible sense, and literature as constituted of objects, discourses, practices, and media. Come to my second point. Differential comparison is supposed to avoid relying on pre-constructed and unquestioned criteria and on second-hand evidence. The second-hand information used by Moratti cannot be considered as objective data for several reasons. The generic labels given to literary texts differ significantly from one discursive community to another, and even more so from one language, literature, and culture to the other, and certainly also within one distinguished international period as modernism. The generic labeling might even differ from one literary instance to another. The author can choose a different label than his translator or editor, who might consider that the book would sell better with another generic label. The editor could have decided to sell the book called Novel by the author as an autobiography, for instance. This happened to Christa Wolf's Kindheitsmuster, designed by her explicitly as Roman, novel, but translated and sold in France as Christa Wolf's autobiography, at a time when she was well known enough to attract a larger readership with autobiography than with fictional text. How can we take into consideration these significant differences if we completely rely on lists establishing according to unquestioned criteria? It seems indeed necessary to ignore them if you want to map the world system of the novel, as Moratti pretends to do. But what is the heuristic gain of such a world system if it is unable to take into account any significant differences in a corpus set to embrace novels of the entire world? Instead of relying on universalistic presumptions and second-hand classifications, it seems more efficient to elaborate the criteria and concepts for literary analysis on the basis of close reading and text-to-text comparison. Differential comparison pleads for reading the text and works under scrutiny as closely as possible. I contend, indeed, that the way of saying is fundamental for the meaning of what is said. Differential comparative analysis cannot ignore the complex ways of saying without risking stereotyped and superficial comprehension, not only of literary discourse, but of any kind of discourse. To escape this danger, the text analyzed by way of differential comparison should preferably be analyzed in the languages that have been conceived, written, and then communicated in. The requirement to elaborate the criteria for analysis and comparison on the basis of text-to-text comparison, allowing to construct the comparable, de construire les comparables, as Marcel Détienne calls it, rather than relying on pre-constructed criteria, results from the epistemological insight that all our theories, notions, and units of analysis are object constructions. The definition of any generic label or literary device, as well as the distinction of a particular period in literary history, such as modernism, are object constructions that need to be re-examined and clarified before being used as criteria for analysis and comparison. This methodological requirement is even more important in dealing with texts and discourses produced in different languages and cultures. As comparatists know well, concepts and concepts and notions do not necessarily denote the same phenomena in different languages and cultures. In fact, they rarely do. Thus, the notion of genre itself, let alone the different generic labels, do not denote the same phenomena in different languages and cultures. The fact that in the critical discourse on the genre tale, the notion fairy tale is indifferently used to label Perrault's Histoire ou Conte du Temps Passé, which he never called Conte de Fées himself, for different reasons. And the Kinder- und Hausmärchen gesammelt durch die Brüder Grimm, the fact that you use the same label dissimulates the significant generic differences the authors themselves introduced consciously in order to differentiate their own creations from those of past periods and other authors and cultures. I will return to this point when discussing how to establish genre and generic reconfiguration as relevant levels for differential comparison under point 4. Needless to say that the use of the notion modernism itself implies different presuppositions in the critical discourse in France and in the United States, for instance. Rather than being silenced, these differences have to be rendered explicit and questioned, and this is precisely what you aim to do in your current research project. Another methodological requirement for differential comparison is closely linked to the necessity to avoid relying on pre-constructed and unquestioned criteria. It is furthermore important to construct the comparable in a way that avoids giving preference to one or several of the texts, discourses, or medias under scrutiny. This means we should elaborate criteria that do not introduce preconceived judgments about the value of the text and discourses and media to be compared, nor favor one of the languages or cultures they come from. This requirement can be neat in a research project by integrating researchers with multiple or complementary linguistic, cultural, and disciplinary competences, of course. Indeed, if we do not grant the same importance to all the objects under scrutiny, we risk again to introduce and impose preconceived values and judgments. This means that we have to deconstruct certain hierarchies imposed by the distinction of major and minor languages, major and minor texts, or kinds of discourse, major and minor genres, major and minor writers, and so forth. This methodological option has important consequences for the constitution of the corpora of text and works to be analyzed and compared. We cannot restrain our choice to the corpus of already canonized works, but have to take into consideration non-canonized texts and works if we want to avoid reintroducing established dogmata alongside with commonplace nationalistic, sexist, or other kind of prejudice we want precisely to get rid of by way of differential comparison. In this regard too, the method advocated here shares the concern formulated in the ABC of Literary History, authored by the MDRN Research Group. This also applies to the necessity to include other kinds and types of discourse in the corpus under scrutiny. Todorov emphasized this necessity in his groundbreaking book Genre du Discours, published in 1978. Quote 2 on your handout. Chaque type de discours, qualifié habituellement de littéraire, a des parents non littéraires, qui lui sont plus proches que tout autre type de discours littéraire. Dominique Maginot also stresses the importance of the multitude of different kinds of discourse and their constitutive interaction in analyzing self-constituting discourses. The relevance of this statement and the methodological requirement it implies has been proved by many comparative analyses I have conducted on different corpora in the past 10 years. Thus, the French tales written in the last decade of the 17th century reveal unexpected and for long unseen political and subversive meanings when compared to other kinds of texts and discourses, such as Perrault's Apologie des Femmes, or Fénelon's treaty on the education of girls, l'éducation des filles, and his courageous letter addressed to Louis XIV in 1693. Much more than offering elements of a supposedly extra discursive context, comparing different types of discourses gives insight into their complex and meaningful interaction. And even more than the aspect of their multitude, the multitude of discourses, I would put focus on their complex way of interacting by way of differentiation. And this is really very striking, actually, in the literary discourse and work. We still do that. People specialize on one type of discourse. So many scholars on Perrault's fairy tales which are not fairy tales, Histoire au conte du temps passé, would have never read the other things he wrote, for instance, Apologie des Femmes, or Le Parallèle des Anciens et des Modernes, because everyone thinks that this genre has nothing to do with the other. While this is absolutely necessary to do this, because they interact, and you can see many things, you can realize many things from comparing the different kind of discourses. And I really recommend this when you write on an author, not to just read the one thing he wrote in one genre. Now, third point, how to define literary discourse. This leads us to the important question of how to define what literary means and how literary discourse functions. Because the answer to this question will determine the elaboration of relevant criteria and levels for comparative and differential analysis. As comparatists well know, there are not one but multiple ways to define this notion. Here again. Concepts of the literary vary from one language, culture, and historical period to the other. They differ according to the paradigms and theoretical idealects that are predominant at a given time in a given scientific culture and within the institutions that are in charge of defining what literary is or should be. I think here again that it is more efficient to analyze the changing definitions according to their respective historical, cultural, and linguistic contingency, rather than to aim for a universalistic and essentialist definition of the literary or the literature. Historical and cultural contingency also affects our way to define and analyze literary writing. We cannot escape this contingency, but we can try to analyze it as such and clarify the presuppositions that determine our own way of understanding literature. This attitude is precisely what distinguishes the subject of theoretical discourse from the subject of ideological discourse, as Peter Zima explains in quote 3 on your handout. Dans le contexte des sciences sociales et culturelles, tous les discours théoriques sont en même temps des discours idéologiques. Et il appartient au sujet d'énonciation de tracer une ligne de démarcation entre idéologie et théorie au niveau discursif. Car c'est à ce niveau qu'il faudrait définir la théorie en sciences humaines. Le discours théorique naît, tout comme le discours idéologique, dans un ou plusieurs sociologues qui articulent en tant que système de valeurs et de normes un point de vue et des intérêts correspondants. Mais à la différence du sujet d'énonciation idéologique, le sujet théorique réfléchit sur sa genèse dans une situation sociolinguistique particulière et sur les mécanismes sémantiques, syntaxiques et narratifs de son discours afin de pouvoir éviter le dualisme sémantique, la dichotomie. Il révèle sa propre contingence et sa particularité s'ouvre ainsi au dialogue avec d'autres discours théoriques. En même temps, il présente ces objets comme des constructions contingentes qui n'excluent pas des constructions concurrentes ou complémentaires issues de discours et de sociolectes complètement différents. Okay, any problem for the French? You need translation? Yes, okay. In order to submit myself to the requirement to reveal the contingency of my own comprehension of literature, I would say that my understanding mainly proceeds from my experience as a convertist, always working on more than one national literature, putting focus on their interaction. On one more literature and one more. My theoretical positions are close to those of Humboldt, Todorov, Michanik, Weinrich, Zima, Meiner, and Maginot. They are furthermore evolving in an ongoing interdisciplinary dialogue with the Italian epistemologist Silvana Moruti, the writer Sylviane Dupuis, and the text linguist Jean-Michel Adon. This is to clarify my own position. My questions regarding literary writing concern, as I said before, its dynamic functions rather than the static features of that literature as such, foremost the complex and differential ways of literary writing to create meaning. The criterion levels I construct for differential comparison are meant to explore the meaningful relations between what is said and how it is said, entre le dit et le dire, as Dominique Maginot puts it. I will return later to the discursive dimension of my own understanding of literary writing. Although I consider the discursive comprehension of literary writing fruitful for the comparative approach I try to theorize and put into praxis, I do not think that it is a necessary condition for the use of differential comparison. One can compare differentially according to other presuppositions and contexts, I think. What counts is the heuristic efficiency when applied to literary writing in different periods, languages, and cultures. The conscious of their historical and cultural contingency, which is usually absent from universalization approaches, also matters because, as Zima said, it allows the dialogue with other positions and approaches. Maybe this is a point for discussion. And I think, for instance, the social poetical approach, which is by many ways, of course, similar to the discursive approach, can establish other, in a complementary way, other levels of comparison, as posterior, for instance. So this could be a point of discussion for this point that discursive comprehension of literature is itself a part of the paradigm we are practicing, which is historically contingent. I come to my fourth point, possible levels for differential analysis and comparison. After having clarified some of the methodological requirements, I would like to make some concrete proposals how to apply differential comparison. Potentially all procedures, devices and strategies activated and distinguished in the production and reception of literary discourse can be constituted as levels for differential analysis and comparison. In the comparative analysis I have undertaken until now, I have put special focus on three levels or dimensions of literary discourse. They correspond to what I consider as discursive dynamics of particular importance in the complex process to create meaning and to create newly relevant meaning by way of differentiation. First level, I want to stress the fact that they are possible levels. It's the focus. So the first is of the three dynamics which I propose to establish as a level for differential comparison proceeds from the comprehension of literary writing as an act and as an event of utterance. As such, it creates meaning by the particular way in which it relates to its context in the moment when it occurs. We can thus compare two literary or any utterances with regard to their particular way of referring to their respective contexts and of enunciation. Maguignou has highlighted the complexity of the relation text, utterance, context. It's really three, yeah? Text, utterance, context. In quote number four, la problématique de l'énonciation, de toute façon, déstabilise les topiques qui opposent simplement ce qui relève du texte et ce qui relève d'un hors-texte. Le sujet qui soutient et se soutient dans l'énonciation n'est ni le morphème « je », sa trace dans l'énoncé, ni quelques points de consistance hors du langage. Entre le texte et le contexte, il y a l'énonciation. Entre l'espace de production et l'espace textuel, il y a la scène d'énonciation, un entre qui déjoue toute extériorité immédiate. I think this is really important. This thing that between text and context, there is something else. A comparative and differential analysis of these complex relationships can do more than just point to the impact of social historical context on literary work as traditional literary history does. The stakes are higher when we take into consideration the important role Maguignou attributes, or his cross-analysis, attributes to the scenography in literary discourse. Scenography is both what discourse comes from, according to Maguignou. Scenography is both what discourse comes from and what discourse generates. It legitimizes a text that in return must show that this scenography from which the speech is proceeding is the pertinent scene for speaking of what it is speaking of. In a scenography are associated a certain representation of the speaker responsible for that discourse, a certain representation of the addressee, of the place, topography, and the moment, chronography of discourse. Those elements are tightly bound. The differential comparison of the scenographies put into place in the collections or in the volumes, in the recueil of tales mentioned before, proved to be extremely efficient and produced many surprising and new insights. It has allowed to show that the presumption of the popular origin of the canonized tales is due to the fact that the scenographies were mistaken for reality, which is quite an amusing thing, actually. The scenographies and the fictive narrative scenes, which are characteristic of the genre. A genre would develop a typical scenography. And the typical scenography, since at least Apuleius, a very famous Latin author who integrated the tale of Psyche and Cupido in his huge volume, The Metamorphoses, he invented a scenography which I think, and I try to show this in my publications, was extremely important for the history of the genre. You might remember the Metamorphosis, the other title of the Metamorphosis, The Golden Ass. That's a title Augustinus gave to this volume. And the main narrator is a donkey, a young man transformed into a donkey by different reasons. We have a specialist here sitting in the audience who can tell you what are the reasons of his transformation into a donkey. And this Lucius is his name. The main narrator, the donkey, says he has overheard, he has listened to this tale when it was narrated, when it was said to a young woman, a young girl, who had been taken hostage by a band of robbers. And the donkey has been captured by these robbers, and he says here, what I tell you here is what this old lady, what this old servant said. So this is the scenography. It is a double faint scenography, because first of all, of course, the tale, the donkey did not write the tale, that the first trompe-l'œil, and then of course the donkey says he had heard the tale by an old woman. So we have a double construction, and by comparative analysis I try to show that first the Italian writers of the Renaissance, Savonarola and of the Baroque, they imitated, well actually they built a scenography which is similar by introducing changes, and then Charles Perrault did do this. And he constructed a scenography really referring to Apuleius' scenography, where he, in a frontispiece you can see this, a young man who signs as being his son, Pierre Perrault d'Armancourt, sits at a fireplace and appears listening to a servant, a woman who tells the Contes de ma mère Loi. Of course, this scenography is a fictive scene, and the point was that the folklorists and then the Grimm brothers who would really strengthen this argument, because they wanted to make the tales pass as popular tales. That was their own ideological aim. So what happened is that this scenography was taken for reality. Or as you have this frontispiece and you see this young man listening to this servant, they must be popular tales. So the whole thing, and then folklorist studies were grounded on the volume of the Grimms, who built up a whole system. But this is very fascinating to see that all this is actually the result of not understanding what scenography is, you see, and taking a fictive scenography for reality. See? And so this is just to tell you I think the heuristic efficiency of this concept, especially because it's still going on. I mean, it is a very interesting cultural phenomenon. So that was just one example. There are many levels of the utterance levels, many other points you can compare. But I think scenography is really something that has to be taken into consideration for many aspects. So I come to my second proposal: generic inscription, generic reconfiguration, generic experimentation. The second discursive dynamic that can be efficiently constituted as a level for differential comparison concerns what I propose to conceive as the inscription of an utterance into the configuration of genres that the writer is familiar with. If we admit that every language, culture, and period elaborates its own configuration of genres considered as cultural practices, the comparison of these configurations proves particularly interesting. We can thus efficiently distinguish and compare different ways elaborated by the writers to inscribe their utterances into the given national and international configurations of genres. Differential analysis allows us then to understand that writers put into action a complex process of what I suggested to call a generic reconfiguration with the prefix re between brackets. This spelling is to indicate that the configuration of a new generic form proceeds from the reconfiguration of existing genres. I didn't say always, because I'm not sure, of course, if this is always the case, but I have the suspicion that genres are made with existing genres in a very inventive way. But anyway, that can be a point for discussion. Differential comparison also shows that the way to inscribe the utterances into the configuration of existing genres can be understood as an attempt to inflect the generic conventions and norms then in force in order to create new conventions and forms better suited to the writer's own discursive and social cultural context and time. Just one example, again, on the tales, because everyone knows something about tales from his childhood. I could draw these conclusions from the text-to-text comparison of Histoire ou tales, Histoire au conte du temps passé, with the grotesque and often obscene conti, authored by the Baroque writer Basile on the one hand, Italian 16th century, 17th, beginning of the 17th century, and the conte galant and frivole by his fellow writer La Fontaine, who had determined the generic conventions of the tale in France for the last 25 years on the other. On one hand, on the other. One hand Basile, one hand La Fontaine. Differential comparison reveals the double process of generic reconfiguration at work in Perrault's tales. Excuse me. They rewrite the Italian tales, adapting them to the French culture and the particular society of the court of Louis XIV. At the same time, they reconfigure La Fontaine's ambivalent genre for a new generation of readers and a historical period that had to come to terms after the first exuberant decades of the reign with the economical and moral disaster caused by the luxurious lifestyle and aggressive politics of the Sun King. So this is to show you have two things. You can, at the time, with the same text, you can reconfigure, adapt Italian genre to French, another period, another society, but you have underlying process that is going on at the same time, which would be this experimentation of genre, which often happens in the same discursive community. Because when you want to establish a genre as a normative, a new thing, you need to have, in some way, kind of support by, or you have to discuss it in the validity of the thing in the same community. To make it going on in some way. So this experimentation is, I think, is an important point. So the intercultural, interlinguistic comparison with Italian or Latin or whatever, on one hand, it can be very useful to compare it to what happens in the French or whatever community discursive community of the writer at the same time, you see. So it's multi-layered, which makes it complicated, but which explains many things actually on how the generic form becomes very different in aspect, because it responds to different challenges, if you want. We can discuss it later as well. Differential comparison of the text of this corpus reveals also that the process of generic reconfiguration is often parallel, that's what I said, not by a process which we can conceive as a generic experimentation. This experimentation proceeds from the discussion that often takes the form of meta-narrative comments between the writers belonging to the same discursive community, as I just said, as La Fontaine and Perrault. They do belong to the same discursive community, as well as I studied a lot on this writer, his niece, the progressive and proto-feminist Marie-Jeanne Heinke, who reconfigures her uncle's tales into what she calls des nouvelles héroïques et satiriques. Here, differential comparison brings to light an intense dialogue about the generic forms that would best correspond to their respective poetics and social objective. They have many aspects in common, but they show significant differences due to the different social situation of the two authors, of Perrault and his niece. So, you see how the configuration works in this aspect. Regarding the relationship between the concepts of generic reconfiguration and experimentation and the concept of auctorial, lectorial, and editorial genericité, Jean-Michel Adam and I developed in our book Le Texte Littéraire, I would say that the notion of generic reconfiguration and experimentation allows to describe more precisely the process of change that results from the dialogue and confrontation with other generic forms. Genericity is rather the result, the complex thing, but the process is, I think, easier described with the reconfiguration or experimentation. But this is a discussion. Come to the third and last proposal, intertextual and interdiscursive dialogism of responsiveness. The third discursive dynamic that can be efficiently established as a level for differential comparison pertains to what can be described as, in reference to Todorov's comment on Bakhtin's work, intertextual dialogism. It analyzes all utterances, but literary discourse makes a particularly complex use of intertextuality, as we know. From a discursive perspective, one can broaden the concept of intertextuality to the one of interdiscursivity proposed by Cesare Segre, and speak of intertextual and interdiscursive dialogism, more adequately so than the static term intertextuality. These terms denote here again a dynamic process which can be retraced and compared more efficiently by way of differential comparison. I suggest to apprehend this process even more actively as a response given by a text or discourse to the proposition of meaning made by another. The notion of intertextual and interdiscursive response or responsiveness makes it possible to overturn the sense of imitation or borrowing traditionally associated with intertextuality, reinforced by the terms hyper and hypotext as coined by Jeanette. On the contrary, the notion of intertextual dialogue, and even more so that of intertextual response, allow us to consider texts and intertext as part of a creative dialogue which, rather than to produce identical or similar meaning, can create new and different meaning. You see the difference, huh? Well, normally when you analyze intertextual and you try to find similarity. How did I, you have statements like, I have to admit I read Flaubert before writing such and such. And you have this idea that that it would be a kind of illicit practice to imitate someone. Actually, I don't think that this is the way that you can really find out what changes. Because it is not only imitation, intertextual, you can just overturn the meaning of a statement. It can just be the contrary. That's exactly what Perrault does, actually. Instead of having his protagonist do the same as Psyche, for instance, he has to do just the contrary. You see? And this is very interesting in, as a concept, as to conceive intertextuality as a reversement of sense, for instance. I'll give you another example. The important literary and cultural practice that consists in rewriting the ancient stories we have been taught to call the Greek myth. This capacity, the capacity of literary discourse to create new and different meaning by way of intertextual dialogism and response. The presumption of a mythical substance or a universal meaning supposedly inherent to the Greek myth often overshadows the fact that this practice owes its enormous impact on European and non-European literatures and cultures to its extraordinary intertextual responsiveness. Sophocles and Euripides' tragedies respond to Homer and Aeschylus. Virgil's and Ovid's work and most other Latin texts respond to Greek literature, thus establishing a fundamental European intertextual and intercultural dialogue, which is then passed on to Italian, Spanish, English, German, and other cultures. All rewritings and reconfigurations of Greek myth, up to their latest representations in the new media, are inscribed in this complex palimpsest and are still broadening their semantic potential. The concept of intertextual dialogism and responsiveness also allow us to rethink the notions of filiation, filiation, and source. Numerous scholars examine ancient texts exclusively in their roles as sources, and not as discourses soliciting intertextual response. They mainly look for certain predefined themes and motives, first in the ancient and then in the modern representations, in order to prove their universal character. However, a methodological motive or theme is not simply taken over as such in the modern rewriting, and even in the ancient rewriting, nor is it developed in the sense the ancient text gave to it. The new text often changes, inverts, or condenses the motives and plot fragments from the ancient text, thus creating different and new meanings. I come to my conclusion. To summarize the insights and results of differential comparison, we can say that the exploration of what is differential does not lead to the discovery of irreducible differences. On the contrary, it enables us to understand that literary utterances come into existence and evolve by responding to each other in an ongoing process of variation, adaptation, proposition, and counterproposition. Differential comparison shows that this dialogical process creates new meaning and that it constitutes an infinite semantic potential for cultural and intercultural interaction. A text-to-text comparison reveals the subtle work of differentiation the writer accomplishes in response to the, as Bakhtin puts it, already existing voices, which are not monolingual but multilingual. Differential comparison also shows that the intertextual and interdiscursive dialogism that underlies literary writing is doubled by a dialogue with the existing discursive and poetical genres, which generate new forms and new cultural practices that are able to express what is different and what has changed. Differential comparison thus confirms Edouard Glissant's optimistic statement in quote number 5, and this is my conclusion. La différence, ce n'est pas ce qui nous sépare, c'est la particule élémentaire de toute relation. C'est par la différence que fonctionne ce que j'appelle la relation avec un grand R. Thank you very much.